me that. Right. The hush descends. Now, I'm Mel Mackenzie. I'm the ecumenical chaplain, recently appointed this year at Victoria. So it's my great pleasure to welcome you this evening. And firstly, to just give first thanks. Still August evening, so well done to you. And I'm really glad that we can give you really comfortable lecture theatre seats for tonight, a bit more comfort than your average Victoria seat, I think. So settle in. It's going to be a great night. And my second thanks goes to Andy, who's come to join us, and it's my great pleasure to introduce him this evening. And I'd also, just before I get on to Andy, also like to introduce my good friend Dr. Phil Fountain, who's a senior lecturer here in religious studies, and he will be chairing our questions at the end. Claps from the sides, thanks. Right, so we'll look forward to that, Phil, so thank you. But just to introduce Andy, Andy is the Reverend Professor Andrew Gosler, and he is Associate Professor in Applied Ethnobiology and Conservation at Oxford University. And you can certainly, you've got to practice those terms, Andy, don't you? Ethnobiology and ethno-ornithology. But I've been getting my tongue around those over the last few days, where I've just had the pleasure of spending a little bit of time with Andy, and and what a joy. So we welcome you and thank you for your effort and preparation this evening. Andy is Associate Professor in Zoology, and if I have it right, Anthropology as well, a joint position. And he's also a fascinating person because he spends his time, as of late, between the university, and he's recently been ordained an Anglican priest in the Diocese of Oxford. So he's weaving things together in his life in wonderful ways. He's also a research director of the EWA, which is the Ethno-Ornithology World Atlas, I believe it's recently become, from an archive into an atlas. And his research interests really lie in this area of ethno-ornithology, which is, as I've been learning, the interface between people and birds, and it's that kind of interesting interaction and relationship that we will hopefully hear some more about. Among other things, Andy's also a trustee of Arosha UK and involved internationally with Arosha, a Christian conservation organisation. And he's also the co-convener, I believe, of Peace, the Oxford University Network of Peace Studies. And he's, I'm just looking forward to what you have to share with us this evening, Andy. It'll be interesting to see what he has to bring us. But he's on his way to a conference in Dunedin, Christians in Science Conference, so at Otago University. And we just, I give a shout out and thanks to Christians in Science for bringing Andy and loaning him to us here for a few days. So it's really just our great pleasure to have you, Andy, and we give you the floor. And if we can give him a warm welcome.
Thank you, Mel. Can you hear me at the back? I've got a bit of Velcro fixing this microphone to me. Well, I can't tell you what a pleasure it is to be here, and I'd like to thank everyone for the invitation, and especially for the hospitality that I've received, and I'm enjoying, in being here. It's wonderful. As a mark of that hospitality, I saw my first kiwi last night, and have bought the badge to mark that. I've only spent 30 years waiting for a kiwi since the first time I was in New Zealand, so that's a real wonderful place. As Mel and I were standing here earlier watching people come in, and she said, you don't know who you've got this evening. You could have anyone this evening. And I'm thinking, I always remember at times like this what Neil Armstrong managed to do with a pulse of 110. So, hey, I'm kind of in good company, whatever. But I did say to her, well, they're filling up the front pews first, so they're not Anglicans. Whatever else is going on here this evening. Well, when I got to Wellington, I hadn't seen this poster before. And so this was the first thing I saw. And it says, here, leading Oxford University academic. And I thought, is that on the internet? Because my lords and masters and paymasters back in Oxford are seeing that, and they're thinking, he's only an associate professor. And so it reminded me also of that old Irish story. I don't know if it's true, it probably is, but it sounds good. Somebody down in County Kerry was, and I can't do a Kerry accent, so I'll have to do the next best thing, was asking someone, a local yokel, the way to somewhere. And he thought, and he said, well, you know, if I wanted to get to there, I'd not be starting from here. And I kind of feel a little bit like that with this poster. So we'll start from various places. There's so many places we can start from, and this is my life. This is one of my fellow ordinands when we were training for ministry. So I was ordained priest 2 months ago. So you know this is all very fresh, and deacon last year. But when I was training for ministry at Custom, one of my fellow ordinands found this on the internet and put it round us all and said, "Does this look familiar?" Oh yes. Oh yes. So those of you who don't believe in the Holy Spirit, let me tell you, she is fun, and she is scary, and she will take you on a roller coaster ride. And I'm going to try and take you on a roller coaster ride because there's so much that I want to get through this evening. But I want to start, because I'm a Franciscan, and this is my professional cross as a Franciscan tertiary, I want to start with the start of the Franciscan blessing. You'll get the rest of it right at the end. And St. Francis said, back in the beginning of the 13th century, he said, "May God bless you with discomfort at easy answers, half-truths, and superficial relationships, so that you may live deep within your heart." And I've been listening to easy answers, half-truths, and superficial relationships for most of my career as a biologist. And it's kind of got to a point where I wanted to know more. And you've got to, if you heard the interview with Kim Hill the other day, then you'll know some about that. I was asked in the invitation for this talk specifically to talk about, could you talk about how Richard Dawkins brought you to faith? Well, you might get a hint of that. I've talked about that quite a lot. And I'll say very briefly, very superficially, something about that at some point. But because that whatever it said on that poster wasn't the title that we agreed, this talk has various titles. So this was one that I suggested a couple of months ago, Faith and Feathers, and Faith and Feathers, A Life's Journey with Birds to Ministry. That was the subtitle that I thought of afterwards. What did we say? Faith and Feathers? Oh my goodness, what are we going to do with that? Okay, so it is going to be a life journey. It's going to be kind of autobiographical, but what I really want to do, and hope that you'll get a sense of the resonances between things scientific and things religious or spiritual. You probably know that I'm a Jewish convert through a long wilderness journey. I talk about, well, after my bar mitzvah, age 13, I said, right, that's religion done with. I'm going birding. Well, we didn't say birding in the early 70s, that's a later affectation, but I'm going bird watching, age 13. And that was me. And now I talk about my wilderness years, from bar mitzvah to baptism. And I started a sermon in college a few months ago with the words, I'm standing there in the, what do you call it? Up in the, oh, whatever. Look at, sorry?
Pulpit.
No. Pulpit. Yeah, that's it. That's standing there in the pulpit, looking down on the 5 students who turned up, and I'm in a collar, and I start with the words, after my bar mitzvah in 1971. Well, there were a few people who thought, oh, I wish there were some more people here. But anyway, enough fun. Let's start with a big question. A big question. You're thinking, what's the big question? What's your favourite bird?
Dead or alive?
Alive. What's your favourite bird?
Tui.
Tui. That's easy, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. How many people would say tui? That's quite fun. No, not many. Other suggestions?
Kia.
Sorry, Quetzal?
Quetzal.
Oh, nice. I heard one. I've never seen one.
Kia.
Kia. Ah. You don't drive, do you? Grey Warbler. That's sweet. They're everywhere.
Seagull.
Penguin.
Any particular penguin?
Emperor.
Emperor penguin, not the New Zealand penguin.
Like you do.
Seagull.
Just seagull. Yeah, go on.
Fantastic.
Fantastic. Yes. Sorry?
Kangaroo.
Kangaroo. Any others? Yes. I saw my first on Tilly with Tang. Oh, they're gorgeous. Yeah, and I gather that is the Maori name for green because of it. And I've got a whole other story about an equivalent thing in English folk names. Well, it's really interesting. If we went around the whole room, of course we'd have no time for anything else, and then we'd go around the whole room again and ask you, well, why is the kia your favourite bird? Because I know what they do, but they're so intelligent. And we do this with sort of audiences and groups in Oxford, and it's really, really interesting. But the older people tend to say local species that they're familiar with, that they have first-hand experience with, even here. Whereas younger people are more inclined to say very generic things like duck, or even penguin, but which in Oxford is way weirder than here. Penguins, we only have chocolate biscuits called penguins. Well, we used to. I'm not sure if we still do. But that's the point, is it gets very generic, and there is this age thing, which is to do with the loss of natural history knowledge. And it's very real, and it's very marked, and that's kind of where my career's gone. So this career shift that I've made from ornithology, sorry about the racket, there's all my somewhere. That's quite fun. From ornithology to ethno-ornithology, oh, it's not. Is to say, as an ornithologist, I'm fascinated by birds, and I have been since I was very small. But as an ethno-ornithologist, I'm fascinated that I'm fascinated by birds. As an anthropologist, does it say that? Yeah. I mean, as an anthropologist, why should humans, why should any species be so interested in other species to the extent of listing them and doing all the things we do? So I've made this sort of career shift from ornithology into anthropology. And I did, I did think if my departments, because I'm half in zoology and half in anthropology, if they don't like this, the zoologist will say I'm an anthropologist, and the anthropologist will say I'm a zoologist. Anyway, let's take that to its full conclusion. I want to go back to the early 80s then, when as a field assistant, I started as a half-time field assistant who might be able to get a grant to do a doctorate. I just finished a master's at Reading in plant taxonomy, and I was working in this gorgeous place, Whiten Woods near Oxford, and that's it with its bluebells in the spring. And we had in a project started in 1947 in one part of Whiten, and then it's extended to the whole 4 square kilometres or whatever it is of the woods. We have nest boxes. It's now over 1,000 nest boxes like this, and they're made of concrete, so they're extremely dangerous if they drop on your head. health and safety told me that I shouldn't use a ladder anymore after 20 years. They said you ought to have a pole and be swinging around in your head. And I said, but my ladder's only that high, and I've only fallen off it. In fact, I've only hurt myself twice with it. I've only fallen off it twice, and I only hurt myself once because I landed in nettles. And they said, no, but health and safety, okay, whatever. So, never mind experiences. So we have all these nest boxes in Whiteham. I no longer work in Whiteham very much. But the great tit population, and this little bird is a great tit, they nest in there, and you can take the front off the nest box, and you can see what's going on in there. And I worked for 30 years in Whiteham, and I always insisted, there we are, almost man and boy, I insisted on working alone because I discovered early on it was much, much more efficient to work alone. In my first year there, I had a friend, a Puerto Rican actually, who was on sabbatical. And he insisted on carrying my ladder. But he didn't know where the nest boxes were. And I did. So I'd go to the nest box, and I have to wait for him to move the ladder, because you don't want it straight under the box, because you take the front off and all the scrap falls on you. And I worked out that in a day's field work, I saved an hour and a half if I worked alone. So then for 30 years I worked alone, and that was the initial reason, but it turned out to be a real blessing to spend 2 to 3 months a year alone in the woods with the birds. And I learned a great deal from that I'll talk a little bit about later. But first, I should say a little bit of the science that came out of all that work. What I'm doing here, point here, what I'm doing there, that was my doctoral study. I'm actually measuring a great tit's beak. I did very detailed studies of great tit ecology, the idea, really a new idea, my idea, that actually an individual animal had its own niche, as opposed to, we know the species has a niche, but every individual must have their own niche, and so I was making very, very detailed observations to test that idea. But one of the things that I did over the space of about 20 years, well, you realise quite early on, this is a clutch of great tit eggs, and they've got these little protoporphyrin speckles, little red-brown speckles. And of course, because I'm an inquisitive soul, I wondered, what are those speckles for? Because it ain't camouflage, because when she lays her eggs in this hole in a tree, she covers them up with a bit of nest material. So she lays one egg a day, covers it up with nest material, goes off. Comes back, roosts there overnight, so she's in there overnight, lays her next egg, covers it up. So it's not camouflage. And it's nothing to do with cuckoos, is the other thing in the literature about these things. So I got to wondering about these speckles. And I realised, when I'd seen lots and lots and lots of these clutches over many years, and I worked out a method of recording the speckle pattern on the eggs, I realised that there was very often a ring of speckles, like you can kind of see here, a ring of spots around the blunt end, around the airspace of the egg. And I got to thinking, I don't think the appearance of these eggs is actually what is relevant. I think I'm looking at engineering, and the fact that this protoporphyrin is red means I can see it. But I think this is something to do with engineering. I'm going to cut an awful lot, long story short, because I've published stuff on this. But one of the things I discovered, I was reminded of this today with Phil when we were climbing back up the hill, that for 30 years I climbed up this hill, Whiteham Woods. All these little dots are nest boxes, so I was responsible for monitoring 300 boxes on the sort of top and north side of the hill, and the shading here is in relation to the calcium, the soil calcium availability, which varies massively from the clays at the bottom of the hill down here. There's similar sort of concentration of calcium in the soil as in a sphagnum, a peat bog. And up here it is absolutely massive because that's limestone. And I recognised after a little while of running up and down this hill that actually these speckly eggs tended more often to be down the bottom of the hill than the top of the hill. So up on the calcium, on the limestone, it looked like they were less speckled. And I as I say, I worked out a way of recording that pattern and demonstrated statistically that was true. It was highly significant. And one result of that, when did we publish this? Quite a while ago. One result of that is the spread. So one measure of this pigmentation pattern we call the spread of speckling, and the spread was correlated with the shell thickness. So what it sort of boils down to, these numbers, these are different clutches of eggs. These were all deserted clutches, so I could take them and take them apart and measure the shell thickness, and I discovered that where the shell was thinner, there was pigment there. They were putting pigment where the shell was thinner, but also this ring of spots marks an area of thinner shell, and if you know how birds' eggs hatch, it's with a blunt end first, so it's almost the dots mark the point, you know, where the chick's going to hatch out, and there's this ring of thinner, but then it strengthens. What the pigment is doing is actually compensating for that thinner shell by strengthening it. From the outside, that works. From the inside, it actually makes it a little bit easier for the chick to get out. So a wonderful, beautiful adaptation. For those of you statistically minded, of course, this tells you that correlation is massively significant. But this is sort of what our kind of science looks like. What do we take as evidence of stuff? That p equals 0.001 means there is a probability of about 1 in 1,000 that relationship is by chance. And so I was taught how to do statistics as an undergraduate, and been using these methods for years and years and years, and I know as a practitioner that what we regard as evidence is based on probability. And so if any scientist stands up on their hind legs and tells you, we know for certain, then I think I get anxious. Because if somebody stood up on my behalf and said, we know for certain that shell thickness is related to eggshell pigmentation in great tits, and it's because of this, I'd have to say, well, I'm sorry, I did that work, and I think it's probably true, but I ain't going to risk my life on it. And that's true of most of the science we do, and we build more and more and more, and we get more and more evidence from different angles, and it's pointing in the same direction, then we can say, okay, well, this is probably right. And we publish that, and the referees tell you the bits, and then you find it, and you know. But that's how the process works. So I'm hinting at Richard Dawkins. There is one thing that he has written repeatedly that I agree with absolutely. Go where the evidence takes you, and don't believe something just because somebody tells you that it is true. And that goes for him as well. I will not believe such and such just because Richard Dawkins tells me it is true. If I find I don't have a job when I get back to Oxford, you'll know. But something more important, that won't happen, that coming out of this over 20 years that I was recording these eggshell patterns, I discovered this amazing decline in this measurement of pigment spread. I mean, it looks like physics. It is amazing. And what that actually, because of that previous relationship, what that actually signals is something like a 6.5% decline in shell thickness over that 20-year period. And that corresponded to a measurable decline, because we had measurements, measurable decline in soil calcium availability, even on this limestone hill. We could record a reduction, a massive reduction in calcium availability, and that has to be because of acid deposition, and the most likely source of acid deposition, Didcot Power Station, which I heard since I left England they've blown up. They blew up the first half of it a few years ago, and they blew up the second half just after I left it. And my wife heard the bang. So these cooling towers no longer exist. But the reason they did that was because they could not work out how to reduce the sulphur emissions from this coal-fired power station. And in fact, the first time when I started looking for a source of acid looking for evidence that Didcot might be the source of the acidification in soil, I literally Googled Didcot Power Station acidification, and whoa, the first thing that popped up was a Swedish government report naming Didcot as the most likely source of sulphur that was acidifying their lakes. I thought, if it can affect Sweden, even if they're wrong, but they're pointing to this, and you know, there's a chemical signature that would allow them to say that it almost certainly is Didcot. If it's affecting Sweden, it's probably affecting White, which is a lot nearer. All of that directed me towards the realization that we cannot do pure ecology anywhere on this planet because of human influence. I start off with a simple question, a pure scientific question. Why are these little bird eggs got spots on them? And it leads me eventually to an anthropogenic pollutant source. It happens that at the same sort of time that I was working through various things in Whiteham, my career was being subtly manipulated. The Holy Spirit was at work, and I can give you the evidence for that, because as my current prof said to me a few years ago, he said, Andy, nobody could have planned your career trajectory, because it's like your career path. And I thought, well, nobody human. But I ended up teaching for the human sciences degree, which focused me more and more on the issue of human agency in the world. So what did I learn from 30 years working alone in the woods with the birds? Well, the first thing, loads of things, of course, not just about the spots on their eggs. Humility. Humility. When, like your wonderful keels, you know, they are so smart. But keels are a lot bigger than a great tit. And great tits are really smart. And they can recognise, they learn to recognise me very specifically. I can change my clothes, but they know the way you walk, you know. And for some birds, particularly males, because they're less kind of devoted to the nest site than the females who spend the time incubating there and all the rest of it. For some males to catch them at the nest, I would have to go 3 territories away before they'd even visit the nest box. And that was a bit of a drag. But I got quite good at it because I recognised those things. So the first thing is humility, that these birds are no pushover, and that's a little passerine bird. you know, that's the most important thing we can learn from nature, I think, is humility. The other thing, which relates, I suppose, to what I said halfway, which relates to what I said about how we know stuff, is the realization that all knowledge is provision. All knowledge is provision. Everything we think we find, you know, a few years later somebody says, well, you know, Gosler wasn't quite right. Darwin wasn't quite right. Dawkins wasn't quite right. Or as St. Paul said, but as for prophecies, they will come to an end. As for tongues, they will cease. As for knowledge, it will come to an end. While we're on scripture, here's three other pithy little sayings that I find particularly cool and resonant with my life and with things that I'll talk about. I love Job, the book of Job, this poor suffering man whose so-called friends come and say, well, I think it's like this, God's like this, because they're complete idiots, aren't they? But ask the animals, God says to Job, but ask the animals and they will teach you, the birds of the air, and they will tell you. And it goes on to talk about the fish and everything else. The other two here are from John's Gospel. Peace I leave with you. This is Jesus. Peace I leave with you. My peace I give to you. I do not give to you as the world gives. I'll come back to that. And I'll come back to this. John 15, 1 to 3. I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine grower. He removes every branch in me that bears no fruit. Every branch that bears fruit, he prunes to make it bear more fruit. And this is in the context of Christian formation and discipleship, but it is resonant with those of us who come to these texts from an evolutionary background. And I'll make that subtle link later on. Okay, so for those who really want to know how Richard Dawkins, I didn't mention the Vicar of Dibley, Richard Dawkins influenced my trajectory from a restless apathy, and I've never described myself as an atheist or an agnostic. I describe myself as an apathetic, because I really just wasn't interested. To say that you are an atheist is a particular statement of belief or non-belief. To say that you're agnostic says, well, it might be or it might not be. But I wasn't even interested in that much. I said, look, people are the problem. Look, they cause soil acidification. People are the problem, and religion is probably a part of that problem, because everything human is the problem. So I was just apathetic about religion. So, you know, if you think you just wake up one day and think, wouldn't it be cool to be a priest? I think it would be nice to spend Sundays presiding at the Eucharist instead of going birding. I can tell you it doesn't work like that. Though it is quite cool. So a few years ago, this book, this is actually a reincarnation of the first version of this book. I got the opportunity to write a bit about that trajectory. And chapter 11 in this surprise and the value of life brings those things together, and I'm in fantastic, honoured company with people like Gillian Prance and Francis Collins. Where did my journey of faith begin? It started with the thing that I've been passionate about for a very long time, since the early 1970s. 1969, Neil and Buzz landed on the moon. It was 11, but the year before, I think it was actually Apollo 9, took that amazing Earthrise photograph, which came to dominate people's perceptions of the Earth as a blue pearl hanging in space. And as I say, I was at a vulnerable, formative, sensitive age when those things were coming out. So a few facts for you that come out of years of scientific endeavour. To our best estimate at the moment, and it's probably wrong, most of the estimates are wrong, there are about 8.7 million species in the world. Different kinds of species, different kinds of plants and animals. Don't worry about how we define species for bacteria and fungi. I know it's complicated, but there's other cleverer people than I have tried to get these figures. Measured as species, ecosystems and genes, this is biodiversity. So as biologists, when we're asked to define biodiversity, that's what we say it is. It's genetic diversity, ecosystem, ecological diversity, and taxonomical species diversity. And the survival of this biodiversity is essential for the persistence of all life on Earth, since through it the climate is regulated, ocean salinity, pH, and other Earth processes are maintained at levels favourable for life itself. And that is known as Gaia science, and we can talk about that if you want, but life's too short just at the moment. The present rate of life's extinction is unprecedented in the last 65 million years. What happened 65 million years ago, boys and girls? Sorry? The dinosaurs did something. Yeah, KT boundary, asteroid impact, dinosaurs go extinct in about a week. I mean, there's this geological layer below which you have dinosaurs, above which you do not have dinosaurs. It's that sudden. And we reckon the asteroid point of impact was either in the Caribbean or it created the Caribbean. Maybe the latter. But that's what happened 65 million years ago, and it had a huge impact in changing, no pun intended, changing the kinds of organisms that there were on the Earth. And we are actually living, if you look at the fossil record over the last 450 million years, we know that we are now living in the most biodiverse time for the last 500 million years. Since the dinosaurs went extinct, all that biomass that was tied up in T-Rexes and things is dispersed through much more diverse organisms. Birds appeared before that, but all those things diversified hugely. This is the most biodiverse time, and we stand to lose a third of species. The 2016 Living Planet report from the Worldwide Fund for Nature makes that point very clearly. It looks at the geological strata. It puts the current environmental crisis in that long-term, that geological time scale, and points out we've just been here for a couple of 100,000 years, 0.2 million years there, tiny little bit there. And we've had such an impact that geologists are now calling this time in which we live the Anthropocene. We've become a geological epoch. And it's a geological epoch that will be marked in millions of years' time, if there's anyone called a geologist to look at what it is, whatever species they might be. They'll find lots of remains of this kind of primate thing, lots of remains of chicken bones, because to the nearest approximation, that's what Homo sapiens eats. And plastic, a layer of plastic in marine sediments everywhere. And you'll know about that. So we're faced with these startling figures, 30% of, possibly 30% of everything threatened. And we're bound to ask, I love that frog, he does look like Kermit. We are bound to ask, how have we gotten into this state where a single species threatens the survival of all life on the planet, including its own? If you take nothing away from this talk but that, let it be that. So I made this transition into, as a result of human sciences and all sorts of other things, into ethno-ornithology, the study of humans and birds, the relationship between humans and birds. And as a result of some chance things back in 2006, I had the pleasure of working with Sonia Tyneman, who's an Australian ornithologist and ethnobiologist, in producing the first ever book on the subject of ethno-ornithology. Published in 2010 in hardback, 2011 in paperback. The publisher said, "I don't think we'll ever go to paperback." The following year we went to paperback. It is still available from all good bookshops and even Amazon, but don't buy from Amazon if they're going to plastic packaging. What did I learn from talking to anthropologists, reading anthropology, reading ethnobiology, and making this transition? Well, one thing, this is a lovely story. Oh, yeah, different ways of knowing. That's an important thing. So this is a lovely story that Sonia had in her chapter, Australian Aboriginal story, tells how pelican and stork once lived together. But they quarrelled all the time over what to eat. So pelican and stork agreed they would go their separate ways and eat their favourite foods, and peace would be restored. Pelican went to live in the lake and eat fish, and stork stayed on the land and ate lizards. And I want to do is a really, really short story. And you think, well, that's quaint, that's rather nice. It's kind of like a Just So story, and you know, how did the elephant get its trunk and kind of thing. You think, well, that's fine, take it or leave it. But I want to do a sort of exegesis on this thing. It's for the theologians. Yeah. You should know that I got 47% for my first essay in New Testament exegesis, so don't expect miracles. I got better. I'm not bitter. What does that story tell us? Well, someone was telling that story. This is part of an oral tradition. It wasn't written down till an ethnographer turned up. So, people are involved, place is involved, time is involved. Any story comes from a particular time and place and people. And culture from a particular culture. It concerns their observation, so they're observant about their surroundings. They notice stuff about the birds, the pelican and the stork. They notice the diversity of life. It's talking about behaviour. They used to quarrel, and they decided not to quarrel. About behaviour. It's about their diet. They eat different things. Once upon a time, maybe they didn't eat different things, but now they eat different things. It's about habitat, the lake and the land. It's about preferences. What's your favourite food? It's about change. It's saying things are not today as they once were. Things have changed. It's about knowledge. This little story encapsulates part of the people's knowledge, and it's part of their traditional knowledge. So it gets handed down, maybe for thousands of years. We know with good evidence that some stories have been handed down for well over 1,000 years, unchanged. It concerns ecology. It's a story. We are storytellers. That's what characterises Homo sapiens. We are storytellers. Maybe dolphins are too, but Kia definitely. But it's about story. It's about conflict. It's about relationship, and it's about peace. All of those things must be concepts to the people who first thought of that story, and maybe that story evolved in conversation. Maybe some little kid said, no, they don't need that. You know, who knows? Maybe this was a negotiated story. It's about wisdom, and most of all, It's about things have not always been as they are now, like the Just So stories, which I suspect, I might get sued, but I suspect Kipling got from some Indian people in India. The smart ones amongst you are thinking, no, he mentions the great green greasy Limpopo River, which is in Africa. So he didn't finish it off in Italy. But it's about ways of knowing, different ways of knowing. And when we think about knowledge and that decline in natural history knowledge that we're seeing in post-industrial societies, then I've been greatly influenced by this book, 2006, Richard Louv, Last Child in the Woods, which is about that decline in natural history knowledge, but a decline in experience of nature amongst children. And he coined the term nature deficit disorder. Now, 3 areas that I've been interested in that 10 minutes left. Ooh, it's impossible. 3 areas I've been interested in. This growing human disconnection from nature, the shifting baseline that every generation only remembers what it was like when they were children. And that's very much. And the global loss of cultural diversity. I want to tell you a little story, and the way I tell stories, this might have to be the last thing I do on it. This young man in the middle here is Nishant Kumar, who's until very recently was a doctoral student of mine. That's his first taste of champagne because he just had his doctoral viva, and they said, yeah, great, you passed. This is David MacDonald, Professor David MacDonald on the right here, brilliant Oxford biologist, conservation biologist, and Professor Ian Newton, retired but still a brilliant former Oxford biologist. And I want to share a little story with you about this event, the 31st of January this year, when Nishant came out of his viva, and I said, was it all right? He said, yes. And I wanted to give him his own copy of our book, Ethno-Ornithology, because he'd been borrowing mine for 3 years. And so, in a bit of a rush, I thought I've got to get one. Never mind the author discount, I'll just order it from Amazon, sorry. So I ordered it from Amazon. He said, do you want it gift wrapped? He said, yeah, gift wrapped it. So it arrives gift wrapped. And he comes out of his viva, and we have a little speech, and I said, I've got this book for you. And he opens it, and he says, Andy, you must sign it. I said, yes, I must sign it. So he gives it to me, and I think there's something really odd about this book, because I know that book. I edited that book. I know that the block of colour plates are 3/4 of the way through that book, not 1/3 of the way through that book, like the one he's just handed me. And I open it, expecting to see this. Whoops. Expecting to see this as the first colour plate. It's a Maori warrior with his huya feathers, and someone had written about that. And what I actually found was this. Well, a little bit of me saying that's cool, but a little bit of me is saying, uh-oh, how many have they printed like that? And I flick through, and there's none of our plates. There's 20 plates of Christian icons. and I said, well, you give me that copy, I'll give you my copy from the office, because you've been using it anyway. Your fingerprints all over it. You can have my copy, I'll still sign it for you, and I'm going to phone the publisher this afternoon. And I phoned the publisher, and they said, whoa, that's weird. Could you take a photograph of what it is and what it should be? So I did that, and that's how I got these pictures, and I sent them to them, and they phoned me back a couple of days later, and they said, well, we've spoken to the printers, and that book on icons is not in our list. That's a different publisher. The printers were working for a different publisher. I said, yes, but how many did they print? He said, that is the only one. Are you kidding? No, that is the only one. They are absolutely adamant that that is the only one in existence. I had to, how did that happen? He said, well, it's really, really complicated. It's really complicated. We haven't got time, and I really haven't got time. And so Holy Spirit, having a laugh. Here's the rest. Here's the rest. And somebody in church yesterday came up to me and she said, "You know what that's telling me?" And we had a lovely little conversation. I'll show you the rest of that photograph with Nishant and us in there. There's someone else in the room, Charles. So we should talk just a little bit about Charles. Is that all right? You give me you should talk a little bit about Charles, because I need to pull in a bit of evolutionary stuff, and that's kind of where we'll go, unless there's a vote for going on. So, Charles Darwin, 1830s, young man, he goes as the captain's he's there as the captain's friend, effectively. He's there to stop the captain going bonkers, because the previous expedition of the Beagle that went to South America, the captain actually committed suicide because he was on his own. So Darwin was actually employed as the captain's companion, but Fitzroy had chosen him because he was a naturalist, and Fitzroy was really keen to have a naturalist with him. And Darwin was not employed as the ship's naturalist, that was somebody else. But out of all of this came Darwin's idea, a model of evolution, which he coined the mode of that to be natural selection, to contrast with artificial selection, which we knew had been going on with pigeons and dogs and stuff for thousands of years. So there's artificial selection. There's evolutionary tree of dogs based on DNA, and all goes back to wolves. But Darwin's theory, there's so much mythology around Darwin. Darwin was not, well, he was quite young actually, and he wasn't a professional naturalist. And you know, he shot these birds, and he didn't actually label which island he collected. So you know, the idea that he saw these birds and he got back on the Beagle, and you know, by tea time he'd worked out the whole theory for the origin of species. No, he really hadn't, and in the origin he doesn't even mention Galapagos and finches in the same breath. It was the ornithologist John Gould back in London who he showed his specimens to, and he said, "Hey, Mr. Darwin, you think you have 6 species here. Well, you don't. You have 13 species of finch, but I'd really like to know which islands each one came from, because I've looked at my atlas, and I see that the Galapagos is an archipelago, and I am a taxonomist, and therefore amneurotic, and I need to know exactly which island each one came from." And it was Fitzroy who helped him put the bits back together from his journals, and said, "Well, you know, Charles, you were only on that island on that day, therefore you must have collected it on that day." And then things started to work, because he had an idea of space. I'll skip William Paley. Basically, his idea of natural selection is that there is variation, and if there is selection for one form versus another, that will become predominant in the population. One of the classic examples is this peppered moth. This is a pale form, and after the Industrial Revolution, the pale forms became much scarcer, and the dark forms became much commoner, because they were easier to, they could hide on the sooty bark of trees, and these poor old so-called typical forms were easily picked out by birds. Another example, more recent, methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus. If you've ever been in hospital and had a swab for MRSA, that is because this bacterium has evolved immunity to methicillin antibiotics. I've got a story about that as well, but we won't go there just now. I'm the true vine, my Father is the vine grower. He removes every branch in me that bears no fruit. Every branch that bears fruit, he prunes to make it bear more fruit. I am going to skip, but you can ask to go back there. That is the first 3 chapters of Genesis written in Hebrew on an egg. Isn't that cool? And you can have that image too if you Google it. Genesis on an egg. It's on the internet. I think it's so lovely. So this is a bit of a sticking point for some people. Genesis 1 is so full of symbolism and imagery, and I'm going to break through it. The menorah of Exodus tells you that that's symbolic. And here are the 7 days of creation represented by this menorah. You can ask me to go back and tell you about the menorah. But the symbolism of all of that in the context of the Anthropocene, that we have nailed God to a tree. Just keep that image in your mind and think about what we are doing to the planet, what we are doing to creation. We've said, no, you don't exist, and actually the truth doesn't exist. As Pilate says to God, the man says to God, what is truth? And don't the people who are that we are most concerned about for their effect on the planet. One wants to buy Greenland, mentioning no names. Can't mention any names because I'm flying off to Pittsburgh in a week's time. But, you know, don't they say what is truth? That's what the Bible's all about. Here is Darwin's theory in a nutshell. I've just given it you. So let's put some bits together and go back to this lovely. Are we all right?
This will be the last one.
No, the last one. Okay. We go back to this story. What if we read Darwin's idea, Darwin's model of evolution, which is not the whole story by any means, and neither is the neo-Darwinian model for the you biologists. What if we read Darwin's idea of evolution by natural selection, driven by competition, as an allegory of that deeper ancient wisdom expressed by the Aborigines, which is embodied in Scripture? Because we're so used to saying, oh, well, this is an allegory of this thing. You know, Genesis is an allegory of evolution. Well, why don't we just turn it around and say, actually, what is reality, and say, actually, what if Darwin's model is an allegory of that deeper wisdom? Because Jesus teaches us to see the world differently. So competition, if we do that, if we turn it on its head, we say competition is inevitable on a finite planet. But if we pay a bit more attention to the outcome and the process of evolution, and a bit less to competition, to the conflict, and say, look, there's competition there, there's conflict there as the cause, might we not see the origin of species as the product of peace building? In fact, might we not see the great diversity of life, 8.7 million or whatever it is, species, as the reflection of God's sacred work of conflict resolution, played out over millions, if not billions, but certainly millions of years. So Jesus said, peace I leave with you, my peace I give to you. I do not give to you as the world gives. Do not let your hearts be troubled, and do not let them be afraid. And that isn't the end, but it sounds like a pretty good place to
have time for Q&A. We've got about 25 minutes. In order to make this work really well, I'd ask you to keep your questions short and keep them questions. Just let me know. I'll manage the process. Let me know if you'd like to ask one, and we'll try to get through as much as we can. I believe, Mel, where are we having dessert?
Ramsey House.
Okay, so if you would like to join us for dessert afterwards, you're more than welcome to. We'll wander down the hill to Ramsey House, chaplaincy, and we can drink coffee and talk more. But are there any questions to start us off? There are lots of questions to start us off.
Sorry, you're Jerry.
I am Jerry. Thank you, Andy. Look, I'll make sure you've got...
Let the deacon do it.